Yeah.
Probably like I used to be a surfer here. I didn't pick up.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Rick Traynor. I'm the rector, that is the head of Exeter College, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Cohen Quad, part of Exeter College, and to this evening's Marett Memorial Lecture, which is mounted jointly between Exeter College and the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography. It's a memorial lecture. Well, the obvious question is, who is it in memory of? Well, as some of you may know, it's in memory of Robert Ranulph Marett, FBA, born as long ago as 1866, died in 1943, who was rector of Exeter College between 1928 and his death during the Second World War, having been a fellow of Exeter for since the 1890s. But of course, that's not the reason why we have a memorial lecture in anthropology named after him. It's because he was a key figure in the development of anthropology as an academic discipline. He published widely in it, though I think, if truth be told, there was no fieldwork behind these books. And he was Oxford's first reader in social anthropology. And in the aftermath of his death, the Memorial Fund was set up. And as long ago as 1947, the first of these lectures was given. Many of you will know that there are often memorial series that sort of peter out after a few years. But this one has been going with only a very few gaps for more than 75 years, which is a tribute to Marett, but also to anthropology in Oxford and elsewhere. And there have been many illustrious lectures and illustrious lecturers, and I'm sure this evening's lecture by Professor Penny Harvey from the University of Manchester will be no exception. So you're very welcome on behalf of Exeter College, and it's my great pleasure to hand over to the head of the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography, Professor David Pratton. David.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Colleagues, friends, as you all know by now, we received the tragic news earlier this week that one of our graduate students, Nabila Welji, had passed away. Nabila had come to Oxford, to the school, and to Keble College last October. She was reading for the MSc in Visual Material and Museum Anthropology. She'd thrown herself into her studies with a doctorate on the horizon, and into a full spectrum of events and initiatives across the university, from the Anthropology Society, the Tyler Library, History Project, the Uncomfortable Oxford Initiative, the weekly departmental seminars, and many more initiatives. She was, by all accounts, enthusiastic, curious, and committed, an engaged scholar of the highest calibre. She was much loved and will be sorely missed. Our thoughts are with her friends and family. There are going to be opportunities to remember and celebrate Nabula's life very soon, but for now, to mark her passing, can I please ask you to observe a minute's silence? Thank you very much. So, it's a very great pleasure to introduce Professor Penny Harvey from the University of Manchester to deliver the 2022 Marett Memorial Lecture. As I'm sure you'll know, Professor Harvey's research began as a study of language based on ethnography with peasant farmers in the Peruvian Andes. And from the early 1990s, that interest in communication and meaning has been inflected in a focus on technology, expertise, and the state, which uses road construction and public infrastructure as its primary focus. This orientation in Professor Harvey's research has produced a prolific range of collaborations, projects, publications. Just to highlight a few of the authored and edited books charting this research trajectory, we start in 1992 researching language, issues of power and method, through 1996, Hybrids of Modernity, Anthropology, the Nation-State, and the Universal Exhibition. With colleagues in 2007, Professor Harvey published Anthropology and Science, Epistemologies in Practice. In 2010, Technologized Images, Technologized Bodies, Anthropological Approaches to a New Politics of Vision. In 2015, Roads, an Anthropology of Infrastructure and Expertise. And in 2017, Infrastructure and Social Complexity. And it's this critical engagement then with science and technology studies which is reflected in today's lecture. The striking features of Professor Harvey's university website entry, which you don't see for many anthropologists, is an affiliation to the Dalton Nuclear Institute. And that, I think, brings us to her latest research and to the title of today's lecture, Thinking in Time about the Deep Future, Nuclear Waste and the Possibilities of Ethnology. Penny, over to you. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the department for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here and see so many people in person, and welcome to anyone who's out there online, where I think some people are. And also thank you to Exeter College for wonderful hospitality. So yes, thank you all, and I'll just get started. Okay, so for the past 5 years or so, I've been working on the conceptual and material infrastructures of nuclear decommissioning in the UK. My original interest arose from conversations that I'd had with a nuclear chemist from the Walton Nuclear Institute, as it happened, about how the contrasting social profiles of different materials have major consequences for the possibilities of research. Manchester University had just been granted £80 million to build a facility for research on graphene. This was a new wonder material with unlimited possibility for future human enterprise. Plutonium, by contrast, had a terrible CV. The material was so political that funding on its still little understood characteristics and capacities was very hard to come by, I was told. So we began to discuss the social and political contours of scientific research and how the huge investment in the UK's nuclear decommissioning programme did not currently finance any systematic qualitative social research. And so the idea formed to look at the unbuilding of a nuclear power station. The qualitative study in decommissioning branched off in several directions as a small group of ethnographically oriented researchers began to look in detail at various activities in and around the Silverfield plant in West Cumbria. We called ourselves the Beam, and we come from anthropology, history of science and technology, management and organisation studies, and nuclear engineering. We're funded in a very minor way by the ESRC, but primarily by the British Nuclear Fuels Endowment Fund. This was set up to support nuclear research at the University of Manchester when the nuclear fuels company ceased trading in 2010. But we were the first social scientists that had ever been funded from this particular purse. Our research focus is primarily on the decommissioning process. We began in West Cumbria, looking broadly at what the closure and unbuilding of the Silverfield plant actually involves. The ethnographic focus has primarily been on the future making implied by this process. So I'm thinking about future making in terms of technological innovation, organisational change, financial and governmental shifts, and the accommodations and contestations of local residents. I've also done some comparative research in Somerset in and around the Hinkley Point complex, until the pandemic actually made it too difficult to continue, so I'm hoping I'll get back there before long now. But then, almost by chance, in 2019, I was actually appointed to Quorum. Quorum is a government advisory body. It's a committee on radioactive waste management. And the committee is chaired by the geographer Nigel Thrift, who some of you might be aware of, and he was very keen to have an anthropologist on board. And I chair a subgroup within that committee that offers scrutiny and advice on the working with communities policy. And this is something I'm going to tell you a bit more about shortly. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on the potent material and social residues of an industry that has only very recently begun to anticipate its own future, in terms of what it might leave behind. In the 1940s, nuclear power was the graphene of its day. Today, however, society, that underdetermined and amorphous collective to which I will return shortly, is confronted with the detritus of that early promise, and the awareness that the traces of the nuclear economy will endure for many hundreds of thousands of years into the future. I approach these nuclear wastes as an unwelcome commons, and indeed a largely unacknowledged commons. Anthropology has a long-established interest in the ways in which social formations, by which I mean communities, institutions, or any kinds of collective, are inflected by colonial legacies, just as they are by the anticipated challenges of climate change, or the lived challenges of climate change for many people, and the environmental consequences of modern industrialized economies. I draw on this body of work on colonial and industrial legacies to approach the question of the social significance of nuclear waste, and the policies devised to deal with this waste. My ethnographic work attends to the ways in which this waste has the kinds of specific socialities and relational dynamics, if you like, that this nuclear waste generates. I also focus, through my Quorum work, this has become more possible, on the efforts of UK policymakers and government agencies to broker a social infrastructure for the disposal of highly radioactive waste materials, that until very recently has resolutely been approached as a technical matter, shut away from public scrutiny and thus largely removed from public awareness. In fact, as I'll mention later, I've come across people who really don't know that there is such a thing as nuclear waste. So in the current climate, that does kind of matter. I consider the diverse ways in which publics and communities are both imagined and brought into being through these efforts as people are confronted by the possibilities that inhere in nuclear waste that is now being newly configured as a collective social responsibility. So I found this was a useful quotation to think with. So this is by Niels Boebant in the book which you might have come across called The Art of Living on a Damaged Planet. It's a chapter he has in there. And he says, if modernity dreamed of the future, the Anthropocene dreams of the present as seen from the future. A perspectival shift that makes our necropolitics apparent to ourselves in the starkest of lights. This powerful and provocative formulation encapsulates widespread fears of the catastrophic threat posed by high-level radioactive nuclear waste. Nuclear threat is foundational to modern apocalyptic imaginaries of human extinction, and it's thus not surprising that nuclear waste provokes end-of-the-world narratives. However, as I follow the halting attempts to find ways to manage nuclear waste in the very long term, it's clear that the perspectival shift to which Bouban refers does not erase the dreams of man-made futures. Modernity is alive and well in the Anthropocene, and the perspectival shift involved in the orientation to thinking about nuclear waste from the perspective of future generations does not stand in the way of continued investment in nuclear technologies for energy security, for military strength, and also for new medical applications. Indeed, it was in conversation with Bouban, Anna Singh and Isabel Stengers on the topic of capitalism, ecology, and catastrophe that Bruno Latour proposed the value of thinking in time, as opposed to assuming the temporality of a catastrophe. To think in time is not to deny the threat. Latour is highly attuned to the potentially irrevocable rupture of the relations between human beings and the material conditions of their lives. In this book, Down to Earth, he describes a ransacked world where globalization promotes deregulation and the flattening and homogenization of the local, where rising inequalities are marked by the walls and barriers of antagonistic identity politics, and where climate change, and even more importantly its denial, are fundamentally transforming the future possibilities for life on the planet. But he is also attentive to how the temporality of catastrophe can immobilize and overwhelm, and thereby erase the ground on and through which alternatives might be built, hence the value of thinking in time. The concept carries a very important ambiguity. It has a sense of urgency, but also of the need to take stock and attend to the here and now. Thinking in time is thus not a straightforward proposition. It's a challenge to set aside the foundational divisions and dichotomies of modern life in order to think more actively and with more urgency about how to care for the common ground. And when he talks about the common ground, it seems to me it's a very specific kind of material inflection of the common good. It's kind of more solid. Latour refers to the common ground on a planetary scale, and he refers to this, what I put here is this short quotation, as the critical zone, that fine layer between the atmosphere and the bedrock, the spaces of multi-species interdependence and cohabitation of soils, plants, animals, aquifers and rocks. Latour is particularly concerned to keep the soil visible as the foundation of planetary life. I found the proposition important and potentially transformative, but there are two key aspects that I want to give a bit more critical attention to tonight. The first is the challenge of how to imagine and to address the incorporation of high-level radioactive waste into this common ground. The critical zone is currently exactly where it's headed. And what are the possibilities for thinking about how these materials might be integrated into wider Earth systems in ways that neither collapse back into the catastrophe nor ignore the possibility? And secondly, what are the possibilities of remaining attuned to the limits of the common ground? I want to work with his idea that the common ground arises not only from the common threat, but from a growing sense of a common lack. It matters to articulate the critical zone as a fragile space from which a species imaginary might arise, from which a species imaginary, that has been hijacked by my own talk. Okay, from a species imaginary which might arise with the power to reconfigure the imaginable and by extension the possible. I also want to emphasize that to think in time carries the urgent requirement to pay attention to all that is not shared across human experience and to all the fundamental unknowns of other human lives and what in anthropology we like to talk as the other than human lives. Working with black radical traditions, Harney and Walton use the term undercommons to refer to what they call the fugitive collectives and the social poesis of otherwise living. They attend to all that is not shared and all that is erased and rendered unreasonable in liberal visions of multi-species accommodation. They offer an important reminder that the species subject, that is the we that appears with the threat of the Anthropocene, is not only fragmented but also unequally invested in formulating solutions to the problems. The problem has been configured by another in relation to concerns that are not singular and not shared in the ways that those with a dominant vision might imagine. Harvey and Walton argue that it's more important to disrupt the standpoints from which things as they are make sense from some limited perspectives, while erasing the presence and even the possibilities that other perspectives produce. This approach is in many ways familiar to anthropologists and consonant, for example, with Viveros de Castro's interest in equivocation as the intrinsic condition of otherness that exists within as well as between what might otherwise be assumed as enduring social collectives. Hence, Viveros de Castro prefers the notion of the perspective over the social. The perspectival highlights the significance of relational specificity. I find the resonance of the undercommons useful for its very direct connection to the way in which nuclear waste is imagined and discussed. And that's the theoretical frame, so you can relax now. And I'm now going to talk more about the actual problem of the nuclear waste. So in this section, I consider how the problem of nuclear waste emerges from an ongoing dynamic configuration of these, what I'm thinking of these three intersecting fields. The first is the historical relationship between the state, corporate capital, supply chains, and emergent publics. The second is the specific inventory of radioactive materials that have been produced in and through these relationships. And thirdly, what I'm thinking of as the complex theatres of safety and control that currently surround these materials. So I'm going to start with the corporate histories, and quite a short history, but just so that you can see the layerings and the accretions and the intersections that this industry is actually made of. Silverfield looms large in the UK's nuclear history and its contemporary decommissioning process. What is now referred to as the Silverfield site began life as a munitions factory in the 1940s. In 1947, it was designated as the site for the UK production of weapons-grade plutonium to support British nuclear armament in the Cold War era. A workforce of 5,000 people built what was then the Windscale facility in an isolated area of West Cumbria. And from 1950, 2 Windscale reactors were operational. In 1956, the first civil nuclear plant called Calder Hall was proudly opened by the Queen, and that also brought 4 new Magnox reactors online in that moment. So this was a very short-lived golden age of nuclear power, associated with national expertise and technological achievement. It underpinned the UK's nuclear deterrent and its place at the table of the nuclear world powers. It promised the generative power of electricity to fuel the emergent post-war economy, summed up in the slogan, oops, I forgot to show you the Queen, summed up in the slogan, the atom joins the grid. But only 1 year later, in 1957, one of the Windscale reactors caught fire. Disaster was averted by chance. This is a really nice techie moment for those of you who like these things. A feature on the main chimney that has been referred to as Cockcroft's folly had been insisted upon by the designer. John Cockcroft, who Ben kindly discovered for me, actually came from my hometown of Pudmorden in West Yorkshire. He was the one that said they really had to put these valves on the top, but it was almost didn't happen because people thought it was, powers that be thought it was too expensive and basically unnecessary. As it turned out, the filters that he added to the chimney captured 95% of the radioactive dust. But this, nevertheless, was still the worst accident in the UK's history, and the Windscale reactors were never used again. When the UK Atomic Energy Authority was established in the 1960s, it retained ownership of the Windscale facilities. But from 1971, a new government-owned company, my benefactors British Nuclear Fuels Limited, took control of operations. And they grew the business of the site, expanding into international markets for the sale of reactors, fuel enrichment, fuel manufacture, and irradiated fuel reprocessing, both for the UK and overseas clients. Huge investments were made in the 1980s in a new fuel cycle infrastructure plants, Magnox encapsulation plants for intermediate level waste treatment, and the image here is of Thorpe, the thermal oxide reprocessing plant, and they had new facilities for the vitrification of high-level waste and for long-term storage. So there was absolutely a massive amount of investment in all these kind of technical possibilities. But by the early 2000s, the UK government was looking to restrain the commercial ambitions of the industry because they were because of the ongoing creation of nuclear liabilities, which are still the highest liabilities in the whole of the Treasury's kind of scope of what they can be worried about. Nuclear still leads the way. Energy production came to an end in 2003, and the focus of the Silverfield plant from then on was exclusively on the reprocessing of national and international spent fuel. And the decommissioning activities in relation to this is undertaken by the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So they were set up in 2004, and the kind of company moved in and out of private ownership for a while, but from 2016, the NDA have been in charge, and they're basically gathering all the spent fuel and all the nuclear waste from all these different power stations on this map and taking it up to Sellafield, which is an important point of relevance later on in the story. So everything then has been closed by 2021. The Sellafield site, nevertheless, is still an amalgam of components and contractors with diverse intersecting remits. So it's a kind of mass of different companies that are actually using this site, even though it's a very compact site. And it's estimated overall that it's going to take about 100 years and upwards of 100 billion to complete this full decommissioning process in the UK. Isabel Stengers writes in more general terms of the sorceress relationship between capitalist logics and ecological disaster, a formulation that seems to capture something of Sellafield's history. I don't have really time in this talk to explore the ramifications of the analogy in any detail, but I do hope that I've shown you that the site is unambiguously connected to the modern faith in the industrial scale and the value of state-led investments to generate and sustain a whole sequence of markets for the production of plutonium, the generation of electricity, the invention of waste management treatment technologies, and most recently the technical possibilities for decommissioning, which in turn includes huge amounts of research in advanced robotics, nuclear chemistry and materials science, as well as the environmental and geological sciences. The notion of the sorceress relationship usefully directs attention to the shape-shifting abilities of the nuclear sector, always vulnerable to a politics of fear, which the industry is paradoxically quite complicit in generating, as I'll describe to you shortly. The nuclear industry constantly positions itself, nevertheless, in opposition to visions of the catastrophic. But it has not, as yet, taken to thinking in time. Industry rhetoric focuses rather on emphasizing a problem in common, like a shared problem that we've all got to deal with now. And the need to do the right thing is what the company kind of talks about in terms of finding a way to dispose of the waste for future generations. So, as I say, I think it's quite important at this stage just to see how that whole history, which was a very commercial, industrial history, has kind of transformed itself into a problem in common that we're now all beholden to deal with. So to say a little bit about the inventory, because it's worth knowing that the UK has an exceptionally complex industry by international standards. All of the UK's high-level wastes are currently stored at Sellafield, along with most of the spent fuel and significant stores of plutonium, which are currently designated as not yet waste, which is a nice kind of anthropological category, as government and industry debates its potential future use. The reprocessing business has produced large amounts of stored waste. A lot of it's fully characterised and contained in concrete or in drums like you see here, which has got kind of specially designed grouting in it and kept underwater to keep it cooled. And it's also, a lot of it's literally turned into glass, which is the vitrification process. There are also more hazardous legacy wastes referred to as sludges. This image always reminds me of a kind of wonderful Indian kind of ritual temple, but it's actually where they keep the nastiest wastes in Sellafield. And what you have in here is a mix of corroded debris, fuel cladding and other irradiated materials, bits of old furniture, protective clothing, anything that might have been irradiated at some point. And it's now stored totally insecurely in aging ponds and waiting for retrieval, classification, reprocessing, packaging and disposal. The radioactivity has also seeped into the ground and formed a plume that you can see kind of coming out of one of those little white buildings on the right there. The plume is wending its slow and meandering way towards the coast. Today, all these materials are not hidden, these problems are not hidden in the sense that they are openly discussed. And indeed, they're openly referred to as an intolerable hazard. And this image that I'm showing you here is an image that's actually produced by Silverfield on its website. And I know that this kind of openness is necessary. It's a necessary step in this reconfiguration of the waste as a problem in common. It was surprising to me anyway, that it wasn't until 1983, when the dumping in the sea finally became illegal, that the first attempt to site a permanent underground facility was proposed. It failed. 2 sites were identified, and Elstow was one of them. And I love this image. It was made by the activists who were kind of protesting, but it kind of has this fantastic image of the peaceful English kind of rural idyll, with this kind of from the underground, this kind of horrible threatening arrival of an invasive toxic waste which are going to destroy life as we know it. As you can see, this was effective. Local people mounted a very effective refusal, probably not helped by they tried to do it in home counties, which they haven't tried that since then. But the nuclear industry, basically, by this time in the 1980s, was no longer generally perceived as a beacon of innovation and progress. The nuclear threat that pervaded the Cold War era had disrupted the rhetoric of atoms for peace, and nuclear power had acquired an aura of a dark, state-sponsored secrecy. 3 Mile Island and the Chernobyl accidents did not simply challenge industry assertion of safety, but they produced new spectres of catastrophic destruction, new regulatory practices, and new hurdles for siting a disposal facility. Every mistake made safe disposal more urgent, but at the same time, the perceived threat of nuclear disaster made political will and social acceptance harder to come by. But the wastes were still there, and the question became focused on how to make them disappear, how to stop the materials from disrupting the modern determination or the modern fantasy of human control. And at this time, awareness of the common lack of any kind of deliberative framework that included the wider public had just begun to get through to some of the industry and policy people who were trying to kind of posit something that wasn't only technical. So that really came quite late in the story. In fact, it was 2008. Since then, it has been government policy to treat and ultimately transfer all high-level radioactive waste to a geological disposal facility. But it was also accepted that the site must be identified via a voluntaristic process, so people have to kind of volunteer for it. So, on the back of that idea, in 2009, another siting attempt was made. This time it focused in West Cumbria, and again it failed. The process was undermined by entrenched dynamics of distrust, fueled by disagreements between experts. There was a great ding-dong of a battle going on between the geologists about whether the territory was suitable or not. There was also big political struggles between local and county councils, with the tensions between the coastal communities of West Cumbria, who were quite keen to be paid for looking after material that they were looking after anyway, and as you can imagine, the councils and the residents of the Lake District National Park who were far less interested in looking after the nuclear waste. And then, of course, there was this ongoing sense, very deeply ingrained, that the developers were still not committed to meaningful engagement with local people. The most recent attempt has been launched just as COVID hit on, so it was launched in 2019 and is still very much underway, and I'm going to come back and tell you a bit more about that in a minute. First, though, I want to just pick up on the point that I made earlier about the way in which the industry colludes in producing this sense of material threat. So Silverfield is a classic industrial site. It's a noisy mess of pipes and ducts, all visible and accessible from the outsides of buildings. So this is an image of the Thorpe reprocessing facility that I mentioned earlier, but just to get you the sense, when you try to take something apart, they constantly have to think of the extent of the interconnections and interdependencies between buildings, so that if you take one thing apart, you might be totally kind of putting at risk whatever else that thing connected to elsewhere. So they have to work very, very slowly and very cautiously. And when it comes to the legacy waste, they know that they don't really know what's there and what it is that they exactly have to manage. So on a recent visit to the site with the Quorum Committee, we were shown the latest retrieval technologies, which were rather like those old grabber devices that you used to get in fun fairs where you kind of got a lucky dip. It's literally like a lucky dip, but it's a kind of high-tech robotic lucky dip. And they kind of grab stuff from the ponds and then try and find out what it is. So that basically they're kind of like trying to find what they've got and think about how to be packaging it and getting it ready for long-term containment. And we were also, of course, told about the plume, and we were told which building was in intolerable condition. And I was quite amused, and then they told us that the one next to it was in a really intolerable condition. So that's kind of, they're not hiding it. So perhaps because of its history of woeful neglect, the contemporary nuclear industry has an obsessive insistence on safety. However, this highly regulated and compliant industry does not make people feel safe. It is as if the greater the insistence on safety, the more dangerous the materials become, as the entanglements between safety and security constantly invoke the ambiguous vagueness of control. On a Silverfield site, there are many active areas that cannot be accessed without protective clothing. There are low barriers in the changing areas that demarcate the active from the passive ground. And we were given orange socks, which I wanted to take away, but they wouldn't let me. But you have to kind of ensure that these socks do not touch the floor. So as we removed our shoes in the active area, you have to swing your feet over the barrier into the passive area, which you can then put your feet down. At regular intervals, we were required to put our hands into machines that register radiation levels and to run handheld monitors over our bodies. Literally, your hair, your face, your arms, your legs, they crackle. And if they beep, no one goes into emergency. You just have to try it again until they don't beep. Nothing serious is anticipated because our guides know full well that we will not have encountered anything serious. A colleague carried her own Geiger counter and reported that we didn't register anywhere near the dose levels of radioactivity that would routinely be encountered on a long-distance flight. Safety, however, is matched by security. There are many, many doors and gates that you have to open, can only be opened with passes and individual PIN numbers. We were tracked at every junction and patted down, guides and visitors alike. The routines are rituals of compliance and collaboration. They also imply that anybody could be there with malicious intent. Materials and people seem to be equally hazardous. Another colleague, an internationally renowned specialist on the epidemiology of low-level radiation, kept up a running commentary on the madness of these procedures. She pointed to a shielded box that was cordoned off. We couldn't get very near, but near enough to see that on the lid it recorded a radiation level of 30 millisieverts an hour. My colleague made a quick calculation. If you were to sit on the box for 24 hours without moving, that is, without going to the loo, eating or drinking or standing up to stretch your legs, then you would get a dose of radiation equivalent to eating 2 bananas. So why, if the hazard is so remote and so low, are there such extreme levels of safety and security? I was confused by these intersecting but discontinuous infrastructures, their entangled histories, and the performances of control that began as a theatre of war and disguise and went on to produce a legacy that still has life, both in those materials that have yet to be identified, characterized, contained, and secured, and in the aura of fear, seclusion, secrecy, and uncertainty that the enactment of security has reproduced over the past 80 years. As I tried to engage with Latour's commitment to thinking in time rather than assuming the temporality of catastrophe, I found myself in a dark, Alice in Wonderland type space, where it isn't always obvious whether you're confronting the apocalypse or a banana. So now I'm going to turn to an ethnographic section on the current efforts to deliver the Geological Disposal Facility, the programme that began in 2019. The two key planks of the policy are the volunteer host community and the suitable geology. Despite the centralisation of government control of financing, regulation, design and delivery, the specific design, budget and timeline cannot be decided upon until a volunteer community has committed to hosting the facility. The nature of a suitable geology also remains open, as the optimal geology can only be defined in relation to the specific geological environment of the volunteer host community. The infrastructural challenge of the GDF is therefore clearly grounded in the need to align the social and technical domains, as acknowledged in this short quotation which was taken from the developer's website. And we have to recognise that they've got to basically talk to people. Nevertheless, this proposition does pose a fundamental challenge to the engineering world, where the problem of the waste materials has from the start been configured in purely technical terms. The social dimension thus only appears once the technical solution is already arrived at. the solution remains in technical hands, and the social appears primarily as a barrier to its implementation. It also does not escape notice that the solution to this social problem is only now being activated with some vigour, as the perceived need for new nuclear produces a new imperative to demonstrate that it is possible to dispose safely of highly radioactive wastes. Despite the clear limitations of the current process, I am nevertheless fascinated by how the language of hosting has emerged to mediate these otherwise differentiating spaces of the social and the technical. Host rocks and host communities are called upon to house the nuclear wastes. From an anthropological perspective, there is of course a deep irony here, as rich literatures on hosts and strangers has explored in many domains. The authors that I've named here and many more have shown how hosting relations are shot through with both possibility and danger. They are, by definition, unsettling. That is their promise. There are different hosting relations, but the hosting relations are also prime sites for equivocation. There's a kind of internalized other in each of these relations. And whether you're talking about the kind of Amazonian affine, which Viveris de Castro would have been interested in, or any kind of other unknown stranger, or volatile material, or government agency, these are all kind of possibilities and offer promises of transformation, but also always a sense of threat. There's no guarantee as to the consequence of engaging this external generative power. I'm going to come back to this after I go a little bit more of the details of what's going on with the geology and the siting process. So I was next going to just tell you a little bit about the geological hosting and what that involves. What you see here is an image of a generic GDF, or generic geological disposal facility. And what you see is a concept currently materialized in institutional, financial, epistemic, political, and public engagement infrastructures. It hasn't been built and there is no site for it. The ambition is to produce an engineered architecture of containment and total isolation. The determination is to dispose of the high-level waste deep in the subsurface, somewhere between 200 and 1,000 metres underground. And this relies on some key geological principles. Firstly, the evidence is established by analogy with the current geological record that demonstrates the stability, strength, and relative permeability of certain rock types over many millions of years. And secondly, it's very interesting when you think of how they talk about the temporality of the subsurface itself. Deep burial enacts its own material and temporal disruption by slowing down the process of dispersal. The ultimate aim of the GDF is to embed the waste in a geological environment where the human time frame, with that time frame where we would register 100,000 years of hazard as a period totally beyond our ability to comprehend. But if you collapse that into a geological timescale where 100,000 years basically doesn't even register at all, it's like nothing. So that's kind of quite an interesting relationship. Underground containment is all about slowing down the process, surrounding the radioactive matter with materials that have very low permeability and huge internal strength, such that the form mutates only very gradually. Geological time promises to disrupt the urgency of environmental threat at the surface, and thus remove it from the sphere of the catastrophe. It appears to make the problem disappear, and some people actually talk about it in those terms. We can disappear it. Now, in the abstract of this paper, I did say that I could say something about some of the things that artists noticed. And I'm afraid I was a bit overambitious there, and I'm not really going to have time to get into that in any detail, but I just wanted to note that these questions about what becomes of materials when they disappear from sight is one of the things that many artists are very interested in and use their work to kind of counter what I'm calling the disappearing act of waste disposal policies. So there's just one image I was just going to show you because that's extremely interesting. Take this from the very useful book of Ellie Carpenter, where she gathers a lot of artistic work on nuclear matters. And this was basically a piece of trinitite that has come from the Fukushima site, and it's been made into something else, and it's actually presented in an exhibit which is called Hidden in Plain Sight. So this idea of what's actually there and where's it there. I think he has to locate this back in the exclusion zone as well, so it's kind of playing with what's visible and what isn't and where things are. Disappearance is also a topic of interest in a strange subfield of nuclear semiotics that springs from the deep concern that future generations might not be aware of the presence of these buried radioactive materials. People might come across them in the future or disturb them by mistake. And the challenge of how exactly to communicate to beings so far ahead of where we live now is far from resolved, but the suggestions are sometimes quite intriguing. My favourite one is these genetically modified cats that change colour when they come near some kind of radiation. But how people will know how to read that, they've got an immense, but anyway, there's lots of experiments going on. So anyway, back to the geology. It's also important to note that isolation does not depend on the rock alone. Suitable geology is not an absolute category, it's a relational possibility, because the rocks will be supported by human ingenuity and the deployment of a series of engineered barriers. So what you have here is a close-up of the layers of design, which involve vitrification, engineered casings, and inserted buffers, all of which combine to further delay the dispersal of radioactive particles. When asked how they can be sure that the facility will be safe into the deep future, experts repeatedly refer to three intersecting forms of evidence. They talk about the evidence that's generated in laboratory research through modelling and simulation processes that allow them to project the speed and the nature of material transformation. They look at the evidence generated in deep underground laboratories, which are equivalent to doing field studies, more or less in situ. And they basically the geologists often say that we're looking for the most boring rock. We're looking for the rock that most geologists aren't interested in. It's not doing anything. It's not interesting. So boring rock is quite important. And thirdly, the exemplars provided in nature itself, such as the absences of harmful radiation levels on the surface in areas where large deposits of uranium exist underground, for example. And I'm just kind of giving a flag now to the anthropologist Vincent Jalenti, who studied the construction of the Finnish geological disposal facility. And he'd done quite an interesting analysis on the diverse modes of expert reckoning that he observed there, including the mobilization of analogies across geological time, the patterned repetitions at the heart of modelling practices, and the skillful toggling back and forth, as he puts it, between human, geological, and ecological scales, both past and future. And the scarce, very slow to acquire human knowledge of how these things are brought together. His point is to which I now turn by a rather different route, is just to draw attention to the things that specialists notice and work on, and the basic, in a way, of what you have to put together to think about safe disposal. His argument is that these skills not only require patient and sustained investment, but they also need to be opened to wider societal consideration as one way of addressing what I'm referring to as a common lack in possibilities for deep time thinking. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the task of eliciting a willing community is envisaged as a linear process. A phased approach, kind of summed up in this diagram that I'll try to explain to you, comprises basically three stages. It begins with a conversation about the possibility of forming a working group. Anyone can propose a working group. Any of you, when I spoke at UCL, someone said, I'm really surprised that UCL management hadn't proposed themselves, but might get it happened. Anyway, to start the process, an interested party, it could be a landowner or a business or a member of a local council, can approach the developer, currently known as Nuclear Waste Services. The working group will form if at least one local council is prepared to publicly declare its interest in the possibility. Nuclear Waste Services will then support the working group to engage the wider population of the relevant electoral ward and to explain the process and to explore the possibilities of a viable search area, and some indication that the council is willing to take the project forward to form a community partnership, which is the second phase. So in this second phase, the initial community of interest is expected to become more of a community of practice. Funds become available to carry out detailed geological surveys and to support the creation of a community vision of ongoing investment. The ultimate goal, which is kind of at the end of this diagram, is to move to the test of public support, which would be a referendum held with the affected electoral ward or wards. If the outcome is positive and the geology is deemed suitable, the developer will be in a position to invest in the production of a final design to draw up a safety case and apply for a formal development consent order, which is kind of legal. It's a legal green flag to let you start spending money. In practice, of course, the process does not unfold in this way. In July 2021, a colleague alerted me to an interview that had just been aired on BBC Radio Lincolnshire. The local MP was on the air expressing her dismay that the developer had been in discussion about the possibility of setting up a working group in the area without her involvement as the local elected parliamentary representative. The interview revealed that there was considerable confusion about who knew what, who had been consulted and when. By some accounts, these conversations had been going on for several years. The MP said that her inbox was flooded with concerns from local people. She added that her aim was not to dismiss the proposal, but to insist that there should be complete transparency. The interviewer pushed her on whether she would support the plans now that she did know about them. She responded that there were a great many unknowns. For example, there was the promise of 700 years of jobs, 700 jobs a year, but for how long would those jobs be there? Not 700 years, she'd have gone for it then. Or maybe artificial intelligence technologies would change that and the jobs wouldn't actually be forthcoming at all. She pointed out that the time frame for this process is really long. The working group and the community partnerships might take 2 decades to come together, but in fact, as she thought about it more, the implications of how long it might take took on a totally different tone. She said this process has implications for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and way beyond. And once taken, the decision to proceed will stay with us for 100,000 years. I love that she's kind of still in there, 100,000 years down the line, but as it should be. Later on in the programme, there was a phone-in, and passionate protests were voiced against which again voiced the assumption that there were already plans in place and that the decision to locate the GDF in the area had already been taken. Key sound bites were repeated at regular intervals over the 2 hours of the programme. We'll not accept. We will fight all the way. We will protest on the streets if we have to. Over 1,000 people have already signed a petition to throw out the plan. They plan to bury the waste in the old gasworks. And they think we're an easy target. We don't want it here. We're not as weak as they think. The developer was confused by the accusations of secrecy when they could see themselves as assuring confidentiality to those who had come with the very first tentative expressions of interest. How else could they have got the conversation underway? They have not sufficiently accounted for the fact that for some, the conversation was already underway and had been for decades, while at the same time, there were others, who I mentioned before, for whom even the notion that nuclear waste existed was news. Many of the most passionate protesters were not responding to the current policy, but to previous histories of a secretive and exclusionary industry, and the suspicion that it was already decided that the GDF would be built in their area. To be sure, there were people who did not want the initial conversation to get underway, but in many cases there was a sense of caution or scepticism rather than outright refusal, and a concern that once the process did get underway, the right to refuse might not be honoured. Trust was clearly an issue. Despite the concern, with remarkable speed, a working group was actually formed, and earlier this year, when COVID restrictions were lifted, the community engagement team set up a series of events that were run in local parish halls, inviting people to come and talk to them to learn more about what would be involved should they decide to move to a community partnership, and then to discuss their questions, reservations, and objections. At the first of these events, the engagement team were met with a padlocked hall and piles of potatoes on the steps. A strong statement that this was an agricultural community that wanted nothing to do with nuclear waste. The meetings I attended a couple of months later were less confrontational, and other community interests had become visible, particularly around tourism, employment, and youth. The engagement team had set up a small exhibition with illustrated panels explaining nuclear waste services' perspectives on why a GDF was needed, on the kinds of geology that they'd be looking for with rock samples and interactive digital maps of existing geological surveys available for people to play with, on developmental possibilities with community investment experts on hand, and a whole range of printed literature for people to pick up and take away. People were encouraged to come in and browse and to ask questions. The questions were actually quite specific. One man arrived with a map of all the possible transport routes from Silverfield to East Lincolnshire, and he wanted to know how the waste would be moved given the current degraded state of the rail links and their vulnerability to sea levels. Others expressed their concern that this development would ruin the outstanding natural beauty of the sand dunes and the reputation of the area as a tourist destination. There was also a concern for safety, and one suggestion that if the materials were coming from Silverfield, then they could expect them to leak, just as they do there. Would they close the beach? How big would the footprint for the boreholes be? But the same people also appeared to be interested and at times surprised by the answers that they received. The team were very careful to emphasise that they weren't there to persuade anyone to do anything. They were just there to inform. They didn't have answers to many of the questions that people had, because this information would be integral to the detailed searches if that part of the process ever got underway. They knew, the company that is, that in general terms the geology was likely to be suitable, but they couldn't know for sure until they could look more closely. The boreholes, the seismic studies, and finally the in-situ laboratory work would have to provide the basis for any final decision, as would the feasibility of the transport links. There were currently, in fact, they also had to point out 4 potential sites, and they needed to choose the most appropriate one. So you're kind of trying to engage people and get them ready for being let down at the same time. There was a marked scepticism about the capacity of the developer to think through the issue of long-term safety. One man introduced himself as a sailor who knew the area very well, and he said he knew from experience that seawater would corrode the steel containers, and the radioactive waste would then be released. He had not appreciated at all that the facility would be well below the seabed and designed specifically to ensure isolation from the water. So there was either little knowledge of or little trust in the regulatory bodies. Concerns over the transportation of waste always seem to trump concerns over the dangers of leaving the waste materials where they are, on the surface, which everyone admits is a really bad idea, and which from the developer's perspective also demonstrated that people had no idea that spent fuel has been travelling around the country by rail for decades. I drove down to the sea and the site of the refinery, which was now reduced to its concrete foundations that I showed you. Showed you before. And that's what it looks like now. And as you can see from this seaside view, it is indeed a beautiful and seemingly wild space. But of course, this is also quite illusory. I learned that this beach is also used for low-flying bombing practice by the RAF throughout the year, except for the months when the seals arrive to breed. The RAF and the seals seem to have accommodated to each other. The beach itself has areas that are closed off also because of significant quantities of munitions that have washed up on them since World War II, when this coast was heavily bombarded. There was even a hint of nostalgia, or more than a hint from some people, for the gas terminal, which I was told used to light up the sky like Las Vegas. The resistance was clearly not simply about an intrusion into a pristine environment, although some did express things in those terms. It seemed to be more about an intrusion on local sensibilities, limits, and autonomy. I offer these details simply to demonstrate the work that would be needed to build a sense of partnership, such that this place might emerge as a possible candidate to host the waste. The Undercommons literature reminds us that such new ideas or plans for transformation never arrive in empty spaces. They arrive where things are already going on, and these might be things that matter most. In East Lincolnshire, there are already accommodations between bomber planes, seals, tourists, farmers, and caravan parks, apparently the largest extension of caravan parks in Europe, and until very recently, obviously, the gas terminal itself. And there are also absences. Among those mentioned are employment, investment, possibilities for young people, educational facilities, or tourist transport infrastructures. So to my mind, the significance of a move from a community of interest, where people begin to come together around questions, doubts, or possibly refusals, to a community of practice, where people are supposed to kind of come together and be supported, to think and act together, to ascertain that the facility could be built safely and in ways that maybe would enhance rather than damage local lives and livelihoods. This move is really all about trying to find a way and a language to think in time, to draw back from the 100,000-year or even the 150-year horizon and see if there's a basis for conversation across difference in the here and now. A conversation that could, for example, include many different perspectives and concerns. A conversation that begins from the perspective of the Undercommons and steps back to reflect on how both problem and solution would need to be iterated and reiterated over time, such that this place could have time itself to come into being as somewhere that might cohere sufficiently to actively volunteer to host the volatile strangers, humans and other than humans, that the GDF would obviously bring into their midst. Now, this is a potentially very radical move, and although it's in the policy, I'm pretty sure that it's not fully understood or even anticipated by any of those currently involved. It doesn't mean they can't find that. Perhaps the key challenge of the policy, in fact, lies in the very concept of community itself, and the very limited awareness within the policy community that neither the community nor a general public is there, formed and waiting to be addressed, far less convinced. In some ways, even the patient and committed interactions of the engagement team start from a Habermasian notion that public engagement, as collective discussion, requires a common ground and a common language, the agreed terms of debate, if you like. The exhibition set up by the engagement team to support the working group did offer this kind of space. However, as the policy initiative moves into the partnership phase, Dewey's notion of public engagement as a site of struggle is perhaps more realistic and more exciting. The engagement team who I spent time with were highly attentive to the possibilities that there are diverse undercommons in play. They're very well aware of the need for the developer to understand the dynamics of difference and to create spaces where differences can surface without drowning each other out. The process is nevertheless unsettling and somewhat untried. It requires a knowing attention to the ambiguities of hosting and commitment to techniques of democratic participation of which the nuclear industry has little understanding and even less experience. So just finally a short conclusion. In conclusion, I want to return to my opening comments on the value of thinking in time and on the value of an ethnographic approach to the common lack, the undercommons, and the dynamics of equivocation. Before starting this research, I was told by an established academic and anti-nuclear activist, in no uncertain terms, that an ethnographer was not really a welcome addition to the field. He assumed that I would be naive and easily seduced and co-opted by the industry to represent something that I didn't properly understand. Hannah Knox and I, when we worked on the road projects in Peru, had also been warned in similar terms. Many people thought that we would be blind to the financial corruption that invariably underpins state projects of this kind. But as the tour encourages us to think in, but just as the tour encourages us to think in time, but does not disavow the catastrophic horizon, so too I enter this ethnographic field with the aim of thinking beyond the singularities that currently shape the debate. By doing so, I can engage instead with the shifting ground and the way in which that ground is made to appear and disappear. And I think about the infrastructures of certainty and doubt that support the shaping of both problem and solution. I do worry at times that this approach might simply be sidestepping the need to decide, but I'm more concerned in the end that the rush to a decision is less important than the attempt to try and make space for public debate to arise from the space of mutual unknowing. Many of the anti-nuclear activists that I've spoken with point out that the GDF is not the answer to the problem of nuclear waste. It will simply enable things to go on as before, with the generation of more waste, more exclusion, more security, parading as safety. Point taken, I don't disagree. But refusal is also a way of ensuring that things go on as before. The disturbing challenge of placing the disposal of nuclear waste in the same space as the need to address climate change is to acknowledge the need and the difficulties involved in the proposal to reimagine human-Earth relations. The community partnerships carry radical potential precisely because they place a threatening but potentially enlivening hosting relation centre stage. This fragile relationship has to be acknowledged because the common lack is primarily about how to take the risk of living with the nuclear waste rather than expecting it to disappear. Indeed, rather than seeking compliant communities and boring rocks, we could instead consider that the promise of hosting relations lies precisely in the awareness of uncertain outcomes as integral to a heightened awareness of all that future plans will leave behind. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I'll say that.
Thanks very much. I think this is a wonderful contribution and intervention into so many different fields. We can think of the anthropology of risk and uncertainty, the anthropology of the future, whether it's near or deep, and the whole productive realm of energy humanities, which is developing very quickly. Penny's very kindly offered to take a few questions, and while you're conjugating far more eloquent questions than I can, I have something that is like your waste, not yet a question. I'm just inspired in thinking through my own history in South Africa around oil and post-oil futures and the relationship between artists and those imaginaries. Taking your postcard from Bedfordshire and the cube, the cube, I'm just really intrigued by your take on what art does in terms of shaping the imaginary. What does popular culture or high art do in relation to the imaginaries, or experts or the imaginaries, or those communities?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, as I say, I haven't kind of really delved into it in great detail, but I'm always struck by, I think the real significance is precisely this issue of not letting something different here. And kind of a lot of the passion with which artists will go about how that cube got put together is like incredibly interesting. It came from a tiny little bit of some highly radioactive matter that then got transformed and transformed and then thought about and put back in specific places. So it's a huge intellectual energy, but also the fact that it's quite opaque in some ways is a challenge that you then got to start unpacking. So I think it's almost like they're like a catalyst for thought, I would think, and about things which are not being thought about. So it's not as if they're going to offer some big solution, but I think they will hope. I think artists do definitely get involved because they want to be party to how the problems get articulated. And hopefully one of the things I managed to put over is when the problem gets articulated in a very singular way as a specific kind of technical issue that just needs a technical solution, then, as we've seen time and time again, that just comes up as a dead end, because people start appearing and becoming hazardous and difficult. So yeah, I think artists in that sense, they're just kind of, they're imagination workers, aren't they? They kind of try to provoke other ways of, and taking the time. It's a skilled, time-consuming effort, artwork as well. And very material, so the fact that they grab it through specific materials is also really, really interesting. Yeah.
Splendid, thanks. So there's a question here, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Yuan, a second-year MPhil student in social anthropology. I think I have a question about the concept of common that you have used, because you've analyzed the reconfiguration of nuclear waste as a kind of common problem, and there are also kind of ways to engage in that problem in a common or public ways. But I was wondering, how common is it as a problem, especially, or are there any kind of tensions or confrontations that were difficult to solve in these public debates? And if there were, what influenced these possibly kind of different perspectives for people? Would that be I don't know, social classes or gender groups or kind of age groups? How would people kind of have different opinions about this, and what influenced it? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. That's a really wonderful question. Yeah, it's really at the heart of what I'm trying to explore. So it's probably shortcuts, because if you've got immersed in the Anthropocene literature, it's kind of the whole point of the politics of the Anthropocene is to reconfigure the subject as the human species, and that's where the threat lies. And so once you've taken that move, it becomes a problem in common. It's our common problem as humans to think about the future of our planet, or we're going to damage the critical zone and the ground on which we live. That we is a constant kind of rallying call, really. And the same with climate change. You hear it all the time, and it's not that that's unimportant. It's extremely important, because it's how you try to generate some kind of collective response. But the thing about the undercommons literature that's so interesting, that comes out of kind of black traditions of being marginalised, not just from solutions, but from even how is the problem put together? They've kind of experienced that in a really raw way of not having any connection to the worlds that they live in. So the trouble is, when you kind of produce this new species subject, which has to be produced up in some ways, you also start undermining all the other possibilities. So I think the sense of trying to work with these different kinds of commons and watch how they're being brought into play by different people at different times, that's what I'm really suggesting. I'm certainly not ready to suggest I've got any answer, but I do really passionately feel that if we don't try and constantly try and making new spaces where different kinds of ways of thinking problems and solutions can start to be discussed, where we've got to break down how we think about the problem and reconfigure it and try and I think this idea of the common is actually a really useful way to do that. So, and the fact that whatever happens, as a species, we still have to live with this stuff. And if you start thinking of it over hundreds of thousands of years, people in the future or whatever. They might not be people. Who knows what we'll be in 100,000 years' time? But so yes, that's what I mean. It's kind of partly about community, partly about commons. How do those get articulated and worked out on the ground? And that's what I see the thinking in time being about. It's actually about. That's why ethnography is so important, because you can really try to track how that's happening and seeing what works and what doesn't and what's possible and where the dead ends will keep coming. That's what I'm trying to say at the end. There's no happy ending. And that's why I think the hosting relation is really great, because nobody ever knows for sure what that relationship is. It's a very dangerous kind of relationship. So the whole point of the host and the stranger is you don't really know the stranger. The stranger could be anything, could be what makes, especially thinking in terms of kin and affines, which is sort of a very kind of popular way of thinking that you have to marry in from, you've got to bring people in from other groups, but are they going to make it better? Are they enemies? Are they friends? How does that change? So that kind of idiom, I think it's great that they've kind of put this at the heart of their policy, because I think that's actually where it's at, but I don't think, they were quite astonished when I talked to them about the anthropology and the hosting relations. So yeah, that was quite fun to reveal.
Hi, thank you, Penny. There's so much in there. I have like 5 questions, but I'll try to just ask one. I was thinking back to David's question about the mass media and the role that our imagination plays. And as you were speaking, I thought every science fiction film about nuclear disasters in the future, I could see playing out in these scenarios. But having been an expert on Japan, I was thinking more about the Fukushima event and how that was portrayed in the mass media. The corruption, the ineptitude, the way the Japanese didn't do anything right, and also the way the Japanese felt betrayed by the PR that the nuclear companies had produced, saying everything was safe and would always be safe. So I'm just wondering, how much do the people you work with look at what's happened in places like Chernobyl and Fukushima and the way that's portrayed when they're trying to deal with the communities that they're hoping will host them?
It's really interesting because they do and they don't. There are no social scientists at all in the developing agencies they recruit. It's kind of like, so we've got people doing the job of social engagement who are incredibly dedicated and really smart and interesting people, but they don't have any background. At the same time, the reaction to Fukushima is also highly technical. There's a massive ongoing. I was involved in the conference, European Atomic Energy Agency. They had a 10 years since Fukushima, every kind of imaginable person, all the regulatory agencies. So the very question, when you get back to this, who formulates the problem, the question of what happened in Fukushima is also absolutely up for grabs. So, my same wonderful colleague who calculated exactly how we were looking at 2 bananas rather than the catastrophe. But she also argues really forcefully that no harm came to people from Fukushima except from the fear of radiation. And the fear of radiation drove, made panic and then almost kind of need to react in all kinds of ways, which was really, really interesting because it's really about the question, were people killed from high-level radioactive exposure, or were they killed from the kind of real total social chaos? Now, I don't know how to answer that because I have no idea, and I'm always, kind of, as I was trying to portray, it makes me just feel really confused. So the phrase of whether we're looking at the catastrophe or looking at the banana is actually quite genuine, this kind of sense of how do you actually untangle that, because what kind of level of expertise do you have to know that? But it's certainly true when you start thinking about the media. It's really difficult because as well, we also know that it's partly entertainment, it's partly can you sell coffee, it's partly, so the bigger the tragedy, the more exciting. That's why the films are all about that and not about, not about bananas, basically. So so I think it's very complicated. But so basically they do engage it. They often engage it on a very technical level. There's huge international conversations about what happened from regulatory perspectives, from technical perspectives, from political perspectives. So that they are very, there's a lot of awareness of that. Much less awareness in the community. As I say, there are communities that don't know there is waste. Because they've never had to think about it.
No awareness of how it may be making communities worry because of the...
Oh no, they do know that. Yeah. But they find it some of them find it irritating. That's why you end up doing this thing that I was trying to say. You've got your technical solution, and then you then only then bring people in, they're very irritating because they don't sign up to what your solution is. So that idea that the social simply becomes something that has to be overcome, rather than needing to rewrite how you formulate a problem in a completely different way that can't just begin from the technical issues. So in Fukushima, it'd be fantastic. I don't know, the Japanese language is so horrible that I could probably, by horrible, I mean so difficult for someone like me, but to kind of get in there, really try to understand how people on the ground are thinking through how it happened and what happened. I think that would be, I'm sure there are people beginning to do that now, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask about bananas and plantains and henset. I want to think about the kind of paralysis that you ended up describing as perpetuating the status quo. And one way possibly to address that, I've played with ideas of hauntings from the future and multiple hauntings which interfere in the present as a way of complexifying the present in a seriously long timescale. And I just wonder if I don't know how one actually operationalizes this in such a bureaucratic framework, but to my mind, there's at least the glimmer of possibility in that.
It is that classic, it is what Buber was saying, that the Anthropocene invites you to think about the present from the perspective of the future. And you could do that in lots of different ways, I suppose. So I think that is kind of integral to a lot of the catastrophic narratives, to be honest. It would be interesting to see a different narrative coming from the perspective of the future, something that wasn't catastrophic. And what would that look like? But while still being unsettling, while still not being certain. That's why I think that hosting is maybe it should be a fantastic movie about hosting different things. There probably are, I'm sure there are, I know people. Things arrive in people's houses and they maybe turn out to be really horrific, and maybe not. We watched some film and people were coming through the walls in different dimensions. I'm remembering that. Anyway, yes, I think that kind of does exist. I think that is the basic trope. And the one that the industry would just see as entertainment, not as challenge.
Fantastically thoughtful report. I don't know now in the very near future, because with the situation we're going forward and saying, oh, we're going to have to reactivate the see what we have. And there was very good news we on, and there are heat going. So I want to maybe help your work come back for you for the next decade or two. And I wonder how these difficulties will react. You mentioned the word panic. How will they react? The British people are quite practical, and they will not want their rights. They will not want and all these sort of community discussion, say the time scale is kind of off the charts, and we need to probably where either executive support or sort of go along with it or whatever. I wonder how you envisage the reaction.
Well, I'll tell you what I hope, but I actually am not very hopeful. They've got to be brave enough to have the conversation. The industry deliberately doesn't. It's really, really recently, as I've been working with them for over 2 years now, it's really recently that they've actually started they took one step in December where they started to engage the wider public. We had a big conference in Westminster, and they got the MPs and they got the journalists, and they started to talk about it. Because before, the fear is if we talk about it, everything's going to get closed down before we even start. But that's because there's never been a commitment to having a conversation about it. It's never been something that's been discussed. And it's so urgent, as you say, it really matters. And that if we're going to have it as an energy discussion, why are we having a discussion about, are we just going to have these 8 new reactors or not? There's no discussion about what energy is, where it comes from. It's not something that kids are taught about in school from the very beginning, to think, what are the different energy options, how do they work, whether we need all the energy that we have, all these kinds of things. And that policy was, it was pretty irresponsible, really. It was written on the back of an envelope, and there's no capacity to deliver those 8 reactors. It's kind of, 2 of them could be pretty easily delivered, and probably will be. There are actually people ready to deliver them. In the timescale that are being proposed, it's pie in the sky. But it nevertheless makes people very anxious, and it does the opposite of a discussion. It's the opposite of what will be helpful. And that's actually being, it is quite disturbing. Even for this poor community group, they were halfway through a week of community engagement. They're done 2 days. On day 3, it comes on the news. That's the first they knew about the idea that suddenly Downing Street was going to announce 8 new reactors. And the calculation then of the amount of waste that they're going to have to deal with way exceeds anything that already exists. So, and hadn't been thought about or calculated or mentioned. It's not even mentioned. It is really problematic. But sometimes, when people really make bad moves, it makes things start to be talked about in other ways. So, that's where you have to, it's not going to be in my lifetime. Some young people here take on the pattern, or our grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, or whatever that phrase was, 100,000 years time, grandchildren. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. That was very interesting. I have a question regarding one point that I thought was very striking. Like you said, that the company, or like the people went there to inform rather than to persuade. And I was wondering about that the company or like the people of the nuclear waste facility came to the locals to inform them rather than to persuade them.
Yes.
And I was wondering, also regarding these voluntary groups, what is like the incentive for the locals or like for a county to have these facilities? Just for context, where I'm from in Germany, the GDR put the nuclear waste facility on the West German border just to, if in the case of an emergency, that the class enemy gets all the waste, right? And the father of Ursula von der Leyen, Ernst Albrecht, put the West German nuclear waste facility close to the East German border just for the same reason, even though geologists said, no, don't put it there, it's not suitable. So what's the political incentive of the placement, and where do people, what's the benefit for the community? And related to that, to the community involvement, I was wondering, did you consider looking at this issue from a perspective of environmental justice? Because I think, as you said, it's a common good that is affecting the whole of society in a way. I was wondering, can you see it through the perspective of distributional, procedural, and recognition justice in a way? So like, who's participating in what way, who's heard, whose arguments are heard, who's participating in the discourse, and actually who's affected by the distribution of this nuclear waste. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, those are key questions. I can answer in kind of 2 levels because I can't know for sure. Because and it's certainly not beyond the bounds of possibility. And I think in the kind of parallel with my roads work, which of course there was massive corruption going on, and that was shown after the event. But wasn't anything that we could follow unless we were going to become like investigative journalists, which wasn't our aim. So I'm not trying to be naive about this, and I think it is quite. So one scenario, which people talk about, is that it's going to stay in Silverfield anyway, and this is a kind of veneer public consultation to make it look as though they've tried to put it somewhere else, because there is quite a lot of experienced protest in West Cumbria, but nevertheless, since it's there already, they've got quite high levels when they do their polls of work out. People voted tomorrow, what would they vote for? They could probably get it through tomorrow. Because people are looking, they've got it there anyway, they're used to it, they know, they've lived with it for a long time, and a lot of people feel, oh, well, we might as well be paid for it, because they are going to pump millions into the communities that take it. And so the cynical kind of like point is that if we can find another community that will then up the ante, and so there starts to be some jeopardy in it, then the West Cumbrians have got to get their act together and decide whether they're going to have it or not, and not keep saying no like they have before. So that's one kind of like scenario which is quite plausible. But when I look at what people actually talk about on the ground, who actually then seriously try to think about it, and in a way, I suppose one part of me kind of has a sinking feeling that my first account is probably the most likely. But then you see people really investing in trying to think it through and think what it could mean. And I think it's basically, as I kind of listed all those kind of things that people don't have, and how, you know, when this big gas facility closed down and people had kind of made friends with it, the fact that they could say, well, actually it was really fun, you know, you could sit on the hill, you could see all the lights, there were loads of jobs, and now young people can't really live there anymore because there aren't any jobs. So I think it's a kind of a bit of a mixture. There's a rather paltry amount of money that would be paid at like a kind of £1 million or £2 million a year, but as you know, that's one major academic grant. That's not really going to refashion a whole community. But if they show serious interest, the community partnership, if people can hold out long enough where the space is less open, the point is that could be the space where you could negotiate something much more significant. You could get new transport infrastructures, you could get a university built, you could really kind of get involved in issues of environmental transformation. There's all kinds of things they could demand if they were in a position to ask. So that I think that's why people might volunteer, and so that's why it tends to be the people who are more interested, people who feel that they are already the abandoned. They're already the abandoned of industrial economy, and they are wondering whether this is another opportunity.
So time is running out, but let's just have one last question.
Thanks, Penny. So my question's about time and politics. In your narrative, there seems to be a gap between intergenerational time. We can experience 3 generations forward. We can do grandchildren, and then we jump to 100,000 years. So that makes me wonder whether and how the organisation you're working with imagines its own continuity and futurity and role, and also what kind of politics would be required to open up something that goes beyond the 3rd generation.
Yeah, well, actually, they do think about it, but they've only just thought about it, and they're shocked by it. So there is a kind of sense that it's the first time that they've ever thought about their own ending. So that I think one of the reasons why they want... There's quite a big debate about whether the facility should be closed and the materials not be retrievable. And there's kind of, in local communities, they quite want them to be retrievable, because there's always this sense that partly because something could go wrong, you won't be able to get in there and sort it out, but partly because these materials might become really valuable in the future, and they might be like a massive resource for something. Who knows what we can invent. So I think that in some ways, the 150-year period is imaginable. It's totally imaginable. And although it won't be the current guise, it's really imaginable, because lots of programs and stuff have been done in that time. So I think that puts it into kind of proper human space. And also the budget then becomes completely imaginable. So the budget for these things, it's this wonderful, I don't know the word for it now, but it's basically a deferral. So you've got 100 billion, but it's kind of spent over 150 years, so it stops looking like so much. But it's a bit fictitious, because it all actually has to be spent at the beginning, but nevertheless, those kind of stretches, and that's really important. And then, of course, 100,000 years is very useful, because that's, as I say, that's the point at which you can make the whole problem disappear, because as long as you've built it and shut it in 150 years, then it's gone. It's gone into deep time, and deep time, 100,000 years, just literally doesn't exist. So that's the kind of weird... I mean, I thought you were going to ask, which is the other kind of complicated bit, about political time, which are 3-year, 4-year, 5-year cycles, and that's really disruptive, because they need a commitment for 150 years. And that's really hard to come by. And that's another reason why these kind of conversations have got to happen. Because if they're only going to be run on a 3, 4, 5-year cycle, you can't get anywhere.
Wonderful. There are many more questions. It's a place to end. There are many more questions. Please join us for those conversations, for a reception outside. And please join me in thanking Penny for a wonderful marathon.
Yeah, yeah.